When we look at the sum total of what he says he's going ahead with here, what's your assessment of that?
Well, it's hard to accept that bottom line. I mean, if you think of just oil, Canada is an enormously important source of refinery fuel in the United States. You put a 25% tariff on Canadian oil, you're looking at 25 cents a gallon of gasoline. People will notice that. And if he goes further to impose tariffs on all oil imports later in the month, then we're going to see a big impact on oil as a feedstock to all sorts of manufacturing, oil as an input into gasoline, and that's just been historically a recipe for inflationary pressures. More broadly, the things that have been so painful to the American consumer have been food and energy. And as the reporter mentioned, you know, we get a lot of vegetables from Mexico. We have an enormous exposure there. So I don't see any real way that you levy these kinds of taxes. And these are big taxes. This is on the order of, you know, something that looks like $500 billion over 10 years and not expect to have some economic impact. That's just the sort of straight-on impact effect of the U.S. announcement that we heard this afternoon. Remember, Canada has been preparing to retaliate and has prepared 2 levels of retaliation and could do that as quickly as these are being implemented. Mexico has promised the same kinds of retaliation, not as firm on their planning. But if you start moving a car back and forth across both the Mexican and the Canadian border and getting tariffs from both countries in the process, that's a really big impact on all the economies. And so this is a far from unimportant move by the president.
Yeah, unless, of course, they're not going to be around for that long, Douglas. And I wonder your thoughts on reporting in the Wall Street Journal this morning, the White House considering several off-ramps, that this is where you start. Yeah. And then maybe you take some things off as conditions are met. We heard earlier from Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau talked about the tariffs here during a meeting of the Council of U.S.-Canada Relations. Here was his take.
Right now, we're showing the new American administration that they have a strong partner in Canada when it comes to upholding border security, all while simultaneously underscoring that we won't back down, that if tariffs are implemented against Canada, we will respond. We won't relent until tariffs are removed, and, of course, everything is on the table.
So what moves Donald Trump in this case? Is it action on fentanyl or immigration, or is it, in fact, dollar-for-dollar matching of these tariffs?
It's far from obvious, but we spent the day at the American Action Forum trying to track exactly what the president was going to do, and the rumors flew fast and furious. So there have obviously been a lot of discussions between the Americans and the Canadians and Mexicans within the White House and the administration. Various leaks come out in the various news sources. They get disavowed. That suggests to me that they are toying with lots of potential off-ramps, that there have been a lot of proposals that the staff supported, didn't get supported by the president, and we'll see how this plays out over time. Certainly, the president has mentioned 2 things on a regular basis, and, you know, historically, what the candidate, Donald Trump, says he does as president. When he repeats something a lot, you should listen to the character of it at a minimum. Number 1 has been he cares a lot about autos, and he wants to move auto production back to the U.S. from both Mexico and Canada. So look for something on that border crossing 6, 7, 8 times to get changed in this negotiation. And the second is better border controls, both in the northern and the southern border, for both people and drugs, fentanyl in particular. Those seem to be the key sticking points for the negotiations.
Well, then you add on the aspect that he wants lower taxes, Douglas, and he has also argued that tariffs are not just about balancing trade relationships more in a way he sees favorable. It's about putting more revenue in the Treasury's coffers. What actual dollar figures would we be looking like here that, say, an external revenue service, if that's going to be created, is going to be able to collect?
Well, I mean, I say this lovingly, but he's wrong on both fronts. This is not going to balance bilateral trade deficits. That's never been an effective strategy. It didn't work with China back in 2018. It's not going to work this time either. Not with China, not with Mexico, not with Canada. The trade deficit situation is a broader macroeconomic phenomenon. They'll have a different strategy if they want to deal with that. And tariffs had never been a broad-based revenue source. At the peak, in the McKinley area that he's so fond of mentioning, we're in single digits, low single digits as a fraction of GDP. The federal government's spending well over 20% of GDP right now. There is no way, in any feasible scenario that tariffs will be the broad-based revenue source that finances that kind of expenditure. And, we've heard a lot of talk about DOGE and controls on spending. We're not going to move that south of 18% down to something like 12 or a feasible number. So put aside any notion of trade balance, put aside any notion that this is the budget balance. This is a strategy to be viewed as an international economic policy with some international economic relations mixed in. That's the right way to think about it. The others are misleading.
Well, I'm not trying to get you off the Christmas card list here, Douglas, but the fact is this entire legislative effort is about to... I'm okay. Well, let's talk honestly here then. They're about to run into something called the CBO, which you used to run. And when these bills are scored, it may not tell a great story. And we're going to hear about how this is an agency that is partisan, that is inaccurate, and does not embrace dynamic scoring. What do our viewers and listeners need to know about this event that's about to take place?
Well, number one, the things that the White House does, these tariffs, other actions that the executive can take, have nothing to do with the scoring of those pieces of legislation. They don't count toward it or subtract from it. So they're going to try to mix and match. Put that aside. Believe the CBO and the Joint Committee on Taxation that score tax legislation are going to give a nonpartisan best answer that they can. That will likely disappoint the partisans, in this case Republicans, who want tax cuts to be very, very cheap and spending cuts to be extremely deep. And they've disappointed Democrats in the Inflation Reduction Act. They're going to disappoint Republicans in this case. That's par for the course. Know that if they get more aggressive, the CBO and the Joint Committee will get it right, and they'll show bigger deficits, not smaller. So you might not get the exact number that you would get if you had 20/20 hindsight, but it's going to be a good faith effort that guides the policy.